I'll introduce myself. I know some of you, but not all. I'm Kristine Forbes. I am an independent historian. I've been doing working on Mormon history for a number of years, but once I met Laura and Kevin at the MHA, I don't know, the last time we had it, Salt Lake City. What's that?
2019.
2019. After that, I have devoted almost all my time to the Mormon Battalion work, because why wouldn't you? It's just so interesting. But in general, I'm interested in everything to do with the Camp of Israel, and this is certainly illuminating that whole era. And I will say I have my personal connection to the Mormon Battalion is just tangential, but there is one. My ancestor, who came when he was only a young boy from Liverpool, an immigrant across the way, and his guardians died on the way to Potawatomi, and John Cox, battalion veteran John Cox, was his guardian for at least a year in Potawatomi. And so that's the first time I ever heard about the Mormon Battalion, was through him. And that little boy grew up to be one of the founders of the San Bernardino colony, and I was born there 4 decades later. So that's my connection. But in any case, what I want to talk to you today is about this big project that I've been working on with Laura, Kevin, Marianne, and my colleague Tom Brown, who I want to introduce and wave to everyone. Tom, if you can. Tom has been working with me, did you say almost 4 years now? Yeah. So he is essential to this whole project, and I may call on him for some questions here and there. But let me make sure this is working. There we go. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the battalion recruitment end of things. We wanted to come up with, we wanted to definitively define who was in the battalion, who are all those other people that people keep saying are in the battalion. So our approach to doing that was to find sources that maybe hadn't even been found before, transcribe them, scrutinize them, reconcile them against each other. We created these data sets and mixed and matched and filtered, and we evaluated those against another data set of every historical roster we could find and match them up, because we wanted to see who was who and what was what. We also, and this was where Marianne was particularly, and Laura too, and people in other parts of the church history library, but identifying exactly the right person. We have a name, we want to make sure it's the right person and the right biographical facts, and ensuring that the Mormon Battalion records are actually attached to the right profile, at whether it's at Family Search or Nauvoo Community Project or wherever it is. So, and what's come out of this? Yes, we do have a definitive list, I'm happy to say. We've also found out a lot of things, that the story is much more complex than you would think, than many of us might think, or than it's been presented sometimes. And the fun thing is the complexity really brings the story to life. So I hope to share some of that with you. And just to link back to the website question, I'm going to be pointing out at various times certain rosters that will be posted on the new website. So they'll be available to all of you. So the first question is, how many men were actually Mormon Battalion soldiers? How many men get that classification? And historians have never agreed. As I said, we transcribed every single list, and that in total, there are 585 unique names that have been at one time or another said to be a battalion soldier. And even back as early as 1886, Bancroft, who wrote a book on California history way back then, said, gee, there's so many different numbers, we don't really know. And there are even other websites or places that post their own personal rosters of who was in the battalion. So we're going to answer that for you. And the answer is in the original documents. That's the place to find the answer. The secondary sources, though, provide important clues. And so these were some of the starting points we had. We had Kevin Henson gave us early on this set of early volunteer lists that I hadn't been familiar with, and I hadn't heard a lot about people using. Those were useful. Marianne transcribed the so-called July 16th muster rolls and put all kinds of notations about how they were, note what the markings were on them. They were very useful. Laura has just what we now call the treasure trove of website, of Excel spreadsheets, but has compilations of all the early history rosters, but all kinds of other things too. And really importantly, Jill, Crandall, and Laura together unearthed some records at NARA that were just definitive, and nobody had been able to look at them before. The August 31st 46 muster rolls and these clothing allowance rolls that happened in between. And so with that, this is my this is the map of what we did. So in the top circle, you'll see the primary sources, things that were our military record that's held usually at NARA, church records, things that maybe the Brigham Young return list or things like that, they're maybe held at CHL or other places, and then contemporary journals and letters. We also use secondary sources like Tyler and Carl Larson, of course, is a huge source for us, all kinds of things like that. And then what we did is put them all in this sifter and put everybody into a bucket at the end. So you'll see on the left side, those are people who at one time or another did volunteer, but they maybe didn't all become soldiers and something happened. They ended up in one of those other buckets, or maybe they were really just a phantom duplicate. And then on the other side, there are a few that were actually were never a volunteer and have just been mischaracterized. So the place we started, the first thing you need to do is put all of those early documents in order, and we put them on a timeline, but I can't give you dates on the timeline because the dates varied depending on which company you're talking about. They varied up until the August 31st rolls. From that point forward, they were consistent, but until then. So, and the main two we were looking at, the July 16th and the August 31st, there were 13 names that were crossed off between them. And some of those names did show up on a lot of the historian lists. And so I'm going to start there and say, how do you explain those 13 discrepancies? And what Tom did is he went through all of those and the list that Marianne did, and we all did this together, and he put whether there was a number by their name and whether there was a backslash or it was an X, or whether there was a notation on the left or on the right, and all of that to say, these are some examples of how they're different. And we could conclude, we could kind of take through, if you go back and put yourself in that time, you can imagine somebody first wrote the list and then somebody crossed something off and then something else happened and the notation was different. So we realized that the men whose names were crossed off with no number on it and no other marking, they withdrew before July 16th, before the ceremony was going on there. If they were not numbered and also marked discharged, that means they did go through that ceremony, but they probably never made it to Sarpies because they got numbered, I believe, when they were issued a blanket. And so some men were crossed off after they were numbered. And so that's kind of how we figured that out. And when we're looking at those documents, we saw something else interesting. And I did say we were always comparing the historian rosters, the early historian rosters, with the roles we were looking at. And we saw that if you look at the 1864 roster that George A. Smith copied from, there was this preliminary roll. And you see, look at the guy in the middle, George Harris, between Haskell and Jones. So that he was on the list for Company B on the 13th. But then the list begun July 16th. You can see he's still on there, but crossed off, and it's now Silas Harris. If you look at the return list, and I know you can't see it on here very well, but trust me, that says Silas Harris. And then again, down here on the clothing roll, it's Silas Harris, no more sign of George. So we now have 14 discrepancies between rolls. We're wondering, what do you make of that? Well, we can see why Silas replaced George is because, and we knew, by the way, going back there, we knew it had to be between the 16th and the 25th when the return lists were sent in. And we find out that on July 21st, in fact, George Harris was called to the High Council at winter quarters. So he was called away for another purpose and needed to be replaced. So we then put this all in a timeline, put all these notes together and who was on what and whatnot. And we found that 9 of the 14 of the discrepancies were dropped from the rolls before they arrived at Fort Leavenworth. And so you can go down here and see that we grouped them by whether they were numbered or not and had a notation or whatever. And so we have 505 names on those rolls combined. And if you go through the math, you know that 497 of the men did leave for Fort Leavenworth. One, of course, Samuel Boley died, so that leaves us 496 who arrived. And also just note up here, this on the green markings to the right of some of the men who were discharged or otherwise dropped at this stage. They were pretty valuable to the Camp of Israel. It wasn't the thing. People have often thought it was that they were either too sick, too young, too old, something. That's why they couldn't go. In fact, they were actually needed, too valuable almost, needed in another capacity. Three of them that left, that were removed from the roles at Council Bluffs, actually were called into Brigham Young's vanguard. And then we, of course, had the bishop, and one went along as an officer servant instead. And two of the others had just been ordained, at least two, had just been ordained into the 70s before departing Nauvoo. So these were important young men here. Then we wanted to see what happened at Fort Leavenworth. Now, I'm not going to expect you to read all of this. It's mostly for you to see that we took all the clues we could have, put them in order, put the journal it was in, or the order book, or a letter, or whatever it was. And what we found is I've just circled this August 6th, we found 2 journals mentioned that soldiers were sworn into service and signed the Articles of War, which is a key clue to say, how should we categorize those 14 men whose names were crossed off? Well, and these are the quotes I've duplicated here, you can read them. What we realize is that was the day, from that day forward, the men were considered soldiers. So anyone that left the roles before that, they were basically just withdrew or were discharged. So we know that the date, July 16th, was a negotiated date. It was for payroll purposes. Brigham Young was able to negotiate to get the payroll to start on the 16th and to get the end of service date moved to the 16th instead of August 6th. So good for him. But that date has been misleading to people. So you will see that the volunteers who departed Council Bluffs but left the roles before the 6th are not soldiers and will not be on our company rosters. The other 5 men who were dropped from the roles, they were dropped at Fort Leavenworth before the official muster. And so we have 496 men arriving and 496 men who were formally mustered in, but 5 of them were not the same men. So we had 5 of the men left. 1 was called to the vanguard, another one, and then the other 4, the ones that left at Fort Leavenworth, deserted the church as well. If they weren't discharged like Clausen, we never found them again. So, and they were replaced. 4 of the new recruits were not LDS. They were men that wandered into Fort Leavenworth and got intrigued. And there were 2 that were recent arrivals from the Camp of Israel. So that is that. Now, we know that on the 6th of August, 1846, we have this letter that Lieutenant Allen wrote as a cover letter to send in his rosters. These were the first official rosters to be sent in, and he said there were 497 men in the battalion that day. And guess what? My tally has 497. I'm very pleased to say at that day. And what we believe is that he submitted the roles that are the ones that we call the July 16th roles, because they had to, because the pay had to start from that date. And he had added successive alterations to those roles. So some of the alterations were done at Council Bluffs before Sarpies, after Sarpies, and some were done by Allen before he sent them in. And here's an example of one of the alterations that Allen would have made. So William Hunter, who happened to be Captain Jesse D. Hunter's son, I think he was only 16 at the time, he was not on the July 15th preliminary list. He wasn't on the return list. And you can see here, his marking is quite different than others on the July 16th roll. It's written in darker in a different pen, not the same. But he is filtered in the same script on August 4th in the clothing roll. So that's an example of how those alterations were done in layers. The other thing to note is that the ranks the men had were not static. So most, if not all, of the company roles that we see reproduced have a set of officers at the top and then the privates. And it turns out that is really hard to pick any particular time that's representative because the ranks changed several times. So there were new officers promoted on August 6th. At Fort Leavenworth, they added some new positions, and then a lot of rank changes happened at the change of command at Santa Fe in October. And there are various other rank changes made for various reasons throughout. So, oops, okay. So here's an example of Philemon Merrill, his rank changes. So on the July 16th roll, he's listed numbered among the privates. On August 4th, he's still listed among the privates, but you see he didn't sign because the officers didn't have to sign. And so it says promoted in pencil right there. And then by the 31st, he's listed among the officers. And by the 30th, the order book tells us he was appointed adjutant. So the order book listed him as 3rd lieutenant. The 1864 historian listed him as 3rd lieutenant. Deseret News added the adjutant. 1881 Tyler listed only the 3rd lieutenant. It always depended on what source they were looking at. So here's an example for Company C, and we have this for all the companies. Over time, the columns are over time sequentially. So at enlistment, when they did the return list, on the equipment rolls, etc. And you can see for Company C, only the captain, his top 2 lieutenants, and his son had the same position at muster out as they did at muster in. Others moved around, came and went, and a few officers were officers for only a few months. So because of that, the rosters we're going to show on the website are not going to have the traditional format. We're going to have a 1 officer roster. In fact, I think I have it showing here. The next one. Where's my slide? Here it is. This is an example. The officers of Company C, it's all 17 of them, alphabetically by the rank muster in, highest rank muster out, and if they held another position. That's what they'll be on the website. And then they'll also just be alphabetized in with all the officers in the company lists. And so our official roster adds up to 496 soldiers. And in the introduction, I mean, David Bigler was wondering, even back when he wrote the introduction for Ricketts' book, you know, there's this one number listed, but everyone else says a number that's higher. And Bancroft had listed, he'd counted 496. And I will say our esteemed Carl Larson and Norma Ricketts each had 496 men in common, and they were all the same ones here. They were the ones. In fact, we see that they had only 2 errors that were the same. Most of the errors were people that were dropped from the rolls, and that would have been hard to know that those were dropped from rolls without understanding that interim date, and there were various things that you couldn't have known. And then there were a few duplicates here, and I'm going to get to where most of those duplicates came from in a minute. Oops, go back. Can we go back? Backwards. There. Nope. There. Okay. So Larson and Ricketts did, however, get very close. So if you look here, what we've done is arrayed, done the error types below the totals. I already gave you the totals before, and I put stars by the ones that use primarily or entirely primary sources. So the omissions, you can see the early historians, they had fewer primary sources available, and so they had omissions. But they also had access to rolls. The people that they helped us understand how names got on the list by the people who they added. Smoot in 1927 introduced us to a new secondary source that caused a lot of trouble, that compiled military service records. I'll tell you about those in a minute. And then the subsequent, I call them compilers. They looked at journal entries, they transcribed other things themselves, and they never reconciled them against a company roll. So the duplicates started growing. So I'm going to start now. I'm going to tell you briefly about these 3 are the key sources for us in solving this whole puzzle. So the early church used the battalion, and I think Kevin Henson wrote this out in a beautiful description on the website. They really wanted to they used the battalion to prove their patriotism. They were under fire for not maybe being as patriotic as people would hope. And so they said, nope, look at us, we serve the country. And so the 1864 Church Historian's Notebook, George Smith started soliciting records for that, and his notebook includes rosters for the first 4 companies. Then Daniel Tyler got involved, and he brought in, he sent the records to the Adjutant General's office, got some input, but they still weren't exactly right, he thought. So he published a list in the Deseret News and asked for people to help correct the errors before they got published, which of course he did in 1881. And so tracing the primary sources that they relied upon at the time helped us understand whether that person that was extra had some prior affiliation with the church or not. So what we did, now this one chart represents about a year of work. So anyway, this chart, what this is showing you is down the rows are those 3 early lists, and then for each company. And what we did is figured out based upon who was omitted, who were the extras, and how their names were spelled, and what rank they were given. We figured out that the time frame that role would have had to be, and then we found the role and we matched them. And so we had deduced for company A, George Smith's list, and then we found it. The same thing went on. Some of these he told us, some of them we figured it out. There was a list we found later that told us we were right on several of them. So anyway, that's basically what we did. And it's a patchwork. Basically, it's a patchwork. Here's one example how Smith in 1864, there was a Guy Kaiser in Company B used his journal to record the first set of enlistees. And we found that list, and it exactly matched Smith's Company B roster. That was a very exciting day when we found that. Also, the matching that we did revealed 3 additional, we helped us figure out how these 3 guys got on the rolls. Why did early historians list these names as soldiers when we never saw them on those July 16th rolls? And that's because they were on one of the 2 early preliminary lists that we found. We found one for Company B and Company E, and there they were. So now we can categorize them. We now have 3 more to add to the dropped from rolls group. There were probably others on other companies. We just don't have those lists. So now I'm going to tell you about the compiled military service records, the CMSRs. They were created between 1892 and 1894 by a new pension office in order to process pensions and not have to flip through all those big old massive military rolls. And the Mormon Battalion records included the information from every roll they had, including those so-called July 16th rolls. And they were really great for us because those rolls still exist. Otherwise, they would have been in shreds. But they are not an adequate source for understanding what's on the rolls, and they've been misused quite a lot. So we in the Mormon Battalion Association website is now going to link directly to original records, which Laura has on Kindex, not to the CMSRs. Those are just a secondary source. But church historian in 1927, church historian Joseph Fielding Smith did want to make sure he didn't leave anyone out. They wanted a complete list if they could. And as we now see that they still were missing some people. Jensen had found 1 more after Tyler, but they were still missing 7. And so he asked Smoot to go do that, and the archivists would not give them the rolls. They made them use just the secondary source, the CMSRs. And so the result is that Smoot's efforts, he actually succeeded in eliminating the omissions, which is great, but he inflated the rolls. So he ended up with 6 more duplicates and 10 more dropped from the rolls than were already on a historian's list. So what I've done here is said sometimes the archivist was the issue because they did not indicate that this was this variant of the name was tied to the same soldier, but sometimes they did. And then in one case, Smoot, it was just a mistranscription, his clerk. And these were basically the people that were dropped from the rolls. The 13 I'd already showed you, but 3 of them had already been identified, so he added the 10 more. Now I'm going to show you what some of those look like. So one of the drop from rolls was Silas Hovey, and the card here, and I know it's hard to see here, but it said down here at the bottom in this green circle, name not borne on subsequent rolls. That meant that he was not a soldier, but the Smoot's list did not add those notations. The other thing is, sometimes, now on the one on the right, actually the one in the middle, Thomas Ivy, you can see that there were also cards that said Thomas Joy, but they were cards filed together. So somebody had said, this is the same guy, and put them together, but Smoot counted them as separate people. And then in this case, the archivist did not make that distinction. The J. Richardson, which actually was a T, was Thomas Richardson. And so that is how that error came on. So now I want to show you, these are the most commonly perpetuated errors. So from all of we added them all up and figured out how many people used what name. And so the top of the list, Samuel Boley, his name is, he was dropped from the rolls because he died, poor guy, before he could get officially mustered in. I'm going to tell you more about Henry Thompson in a minute, that duplicate. Then we've got some other drop from the rolls and some other interesting things. Jesse Earl was also Justice Earl, and he was on one of the sources, one of Tyler's sources, he was listed Jesse as a private, and another different document at a different time had him as Justice and a musician, and he's the same guy. They were never on the same roll. Either Justice or Jesse, never both. And then there were these what else? I already talked about the CMSRs. So another kind of mistake were people that a historian just didn't realize were not actually affiliated. So 2 of them were CMSRs for the California Volunteers, which was recruited from mostly the battalion re-enlisters, but these 2 gentlemen were officer servants that enlisted in the California Volunteers, not re-enlisted, but many people refer to them as re-enlisters, and they get added to the rolls. Milton Kelly was Golder. He was an officer servant also who went to with the detachments and perhaps was mentioned in a journal or something, and so they called him a soldier as well. And this guy, we're not sure why Carr added him, but he wasn't. So there may be others that we don't know. This one is kind of fun. I think this is Laura's favorite maybe, but so Company D, the accoutrements roll, they had used, and that's used by Smith in 1864 for Company D. It lists all the Company D guys except it has Henry Thompson, and it doesn't have Miles Thompson. From that's the only roll like that. Every other roll has Miles Thompson and no Henry. And so we can't say why that particular person who wrote that list wrote Henry. We have no idea why, but it never happened again. But Smith made the error. Deseret News, they fixed it. Tyler put them both in and created the duplicate. And that was one of the biggest ones. So speaking of duplicates, as I said, the main key to that is you will never find both on the same company roll. You can always reconcile with the company roll and figure it out. So there were 2 main kinds of duplicates, either name variations that the recorder wrote differently, or maybe the person themselves used a different name sometimes, or the transcriber made a mistake. And the other kind is a company duplicate. And we did find this other phenomenon as some of the men at Council Bluffs switched companies, crossed off of one, added to another. And if the early historian had rolls from different time frames, they listed them both. And it looked like 2 people. So we are going to, this is just an example of what the duplicates will look like on the website. They'll have their name, their company, these are the actual people on the left, and then the duplicate for those people on the right, and what they were, what kind of duplicate it was. How did that come about? We were also going to have a section called Correcting the Record that I think is going to have a copy of this video on it, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll have rosters of errors on it and maybe some other narratives. I don't know. We'll see what comes, but that's where you'll find those. So after all that, we have 9 mysteries remaining after all those, what was it, 585? We have 2 of them are real people, 7 of them are not sure if they're real or not. And I suspect there could be, each of these 2 could be, they could be dropped from the rolls as well if there were an earlier preliminary listing for company C and E. The others, and it's also possible for William Cox, these other 3, they could be real people that were dropped, we're not sure. And the other 4, we have no idea. They're probably duplicates or something, not sure. One other thing I mentioned, Kevin found the early volunteer list, and we actually, Tom and I found a 3rd one and transcribed that. And so together with those 3 lists, we found 126 names on these 3 lists from either Mount Pisgah or Council Bluffs that predate the July 16th enrollment rolls. And most of them did enlist, but not all. And so as you see, there were 126, 71 of them enlisted, and 2 of those were dropped, but 69 became soldiers. And of those who didn't enlist, quite a number, 43 of the 55 remain in the camp of Israel, and several of them, 11 of them, were in a Brigham Young company. And so they were probably very similar to those other drop from rolls that we saw. And so we are going to find a way to honor them somehow. Laura and I were talking about that yesterday. Maybe there'll be some sort of little merit badge and designation on their name or something like that. And this is a whole story in itself that I am writing, and that story will probably be posted there too at some point about who are those men, how did that happen? And some of them were from Garden Grove. We don't have a list yet of those, but we know some men that were in Garden Grove that could have been on that list. So if we find it, we'll be excited. And so here's the summary of what the records revealed. We have the definitive list of the 496, and we know how fluid the rolls were. We're going to have some early volunteer lists. We're going to have the drop from rolls list. We know that the officer rosters also changed a lot, so we're going to have a compiled officer list. And we know this July 16th date is the actual date we need to be focused on is August 6th, and we're going to update the timeline for that. And our goal is, and Marianne has been, and Laura too, working very hard to get the information about the Mormon Battalion men to be consistent across all the LDS sites, because there are a lot of places that have different things, and we want to make sure they're all the same. And just as a heads up, the next project that I know Kevin and Marianne and I are working on, and Tom, is what happened to the men post-discharge. We're going to tell you what the records revealed. That'll be the next presentation one of these days.